In today's video, we're going to be talking about a classic technique called the Sunny 16 rule. And this is a super simple technique that film photographers can use to get their exposure right every single time without ever having to look at a light meter, either in their camera or externally. So I'm going to take you through a really simple version of how to understand the Sunny 16 rule, and then show you at the end some examples of some different photos made on film and also digitally using the Sunny 16 rule. So let's jump right in. What's up everybody, my name is Ryan. I'm a photographer based in New York City, and thanks for watching my video. On this channel, I focus on sharing everything that I know, both as a hobbyist photographer as well as a professional photographer, with people who love photography like I do, as well as people who are trying to learn and get better at their craft. So if this is your first time here checking out one of my videos, thanks so much for checking me out, and if you've been here before, thanks for coming back. Street photography and travel photography, anything that's sort of journalistic in nature, if you will, or reportage, is all about capturing those candid moments in life, whether you're staging them or you're just walking by them and they happen naturally. And one of the most important parts of that is understanding how to get a perfect exposure every single time one of those moments happen, without having to think, and basically just being ready when the moment happens. Sunny 16 is a massive shortcut to enable you to do that. But before we talk Sunny 16, let's talk just about some fundamentals to make sure that we are on the same page about what makes an exposure. Okay, so let's talk the basics of exposure. There are three pieces of exposure, or what we call the exposure triangle, that are fundamental to understanding how any image is made on film or digitally. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. The aperture is literally how large the hole in the lens is going to be, or how much light a lens is going to let through to touch the strip of film or the digital sensor on a digital camera. The shutter speed is literally how fast the shutter of the camera is going to open and close to let that light through to hit the strip of film or the digital sensor. The ISO is how sensitive the roll of film or the digital sensor is going to be to the ambient light that you are letting in to hit the roll of film or the shutter. These three things together work together to create a perfect exposure. And basically the way that it works is if one goes up, then another must go down. There's a concept that we call reciprocity, which means that once you've created a balanced exposure by finding the right value for your aperture, shutter, and your ISO, if you were to change one of those, you're going to need to change another one in the opposite direction to compensate for the more or less light that you would be letting in. Now, this is a more advanced concept, and we're not going to really go into that in this video. I will make another video about sort of, more advanced exposure techniques using Sunny 16 as a baseline. But for today, let's just keep it simple. As long as you understand that there are three components of the exposure triangle, and they are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, we are good to go for today. Now, as I mentioned, the Sunny 16 rule is basically just a shortcut. It's a shortcut to take out two pieces of those three components of the exposure triangle so that you always get a correct and accurate exposure reading in outdoor conditions, let's say, without having to look at a light meter. And there is, believe it or not, and helpfully, a cheat sheet. This cheat sheet. Now, this is a place for you to make a screenshot of the chart itself and start to memorize it. But if you Google it, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of versions of this on Google Images. So there's no shortage of access to what this chart means, but I'm going to walk you through how to apply this chart to your images to get that proper exposure. Okay, now the first piece of this is the easiest piece because we're gonna set it and forget it. Once we set this baseline part of the Sunny 16 up in our camera with our film, or this works digitally as well, but we're really focused on film today. Once you've set this, you can forget it. Set it and forget it. The concept is very simple. It's basically that your ISO is going to determine your shutter speed. Now, what I mean by that is if I have 3 rolls of film here, each of these rolls of film has a different ISO or ASA, but let's keep the terminology at ISO today. We can start with this roll of Kodak Gold 200. This has a 200 speed, as you can see here, which means that it's rated at 200. Your digital camera, the equivalent would be ISO 200. I have a roll of 400 speed film here, so Ilford HP5 plus 400 means that this film is rated at 400. Another example is this roll of Portra 800. So you can see here that the value on the roll of film is 800. This roll of Kodak Gold 200 is less sensitive to light than the roll of Portra 800. The larger the ISO number, the more sensitive the roll of film is going to be to the light. However, with the Sunny 16, that doesn't even matter. You can forget about that for now as just a baseline way of understanding how to set your exposure. And what I mean by that is this. If I'm working with a 200 speed film, so Kodak Gold 200, all I'm going to do is set my shutter speed on my camera to match the 200 of the film here. What that means is we're going to take the inverse, but let's simplify that. We don't need to be thinking about fractions and inverses. Literally, the speed of the film is ISO 200. The shutter speed is meant to be 1/200th of a second, or the closest value on your camera that comes to 1/200th of a second. For me, on my cameras and for most film cameras, that's actually going to be 1/250th of a second. So for 200 speed film, you set your shutter to 1/250th of a second. For a 400 speed film, you set your shutter speed to 1/400th of a second, or on most cameras, that's actually 1/500th of a second. So ISO 400 speed equals 1/500th of a second on most film cameras. ISO 800 film, like Portra 800, is going to be set to 1/800, or 1/800th of a second. Now again, the closest value on most film cameras is going to be 1/1000th of a second. So in summary, ISO 200 is 1/250th of a second, ISO 400 is 1/500th of a second, and ISO 800 film is going to be 1/1000th of a second. Now, it doesn't need to be perfect. You just need it to be close enough to that value. If your camera has a value that's closer to the actual number of the speed, so instead of going, ISO 400 and 1/500th of a second, you go ISO 400 and 1/400th of a second, even better. But most film cameras, especially some of the vintage and older ones, don't have the capability for some of those in-between values on shutter speed. Okay, we've done the basics here. We understand the 3 components of the exposure triangle. We've set our shutter speed to equal the inverse of our ISO. Super simple, ISO 200 equals 1/250th of a second, etc. That's where this chart now comes in. The only thing that you need to think about for the rest of the day in any of these circumstances is what is the aperture value of the lens that you're using. This is a 28mm lens for the Leica M mount camera. The Fuji cameras have great manual lenses as well. I will say that the rule of Sunny 16 works most easily on cameras where you have the ability to manually and quickly change the aperture value of the lens, but it does work on cameras that have a more mechanized version of that where it's built into the camera body. The way that this works is exactly the same. And the way that it works is this. If we look at the chart, the place that we want to start is with a sunny day and no clouds. Your value is going to be set at f16. It's your starting place. That's always where you would begin conceptually to assess what the light of a scene is going to look like. This is for bright sunny days with no clouds. The less light that is available to you in the sky and in your surroundings, the more you're going to open your aperture or let more light in. And you don't need to worry about things like open and close. Some of that gets a little bit tricky. All you need to know is that if there's less light, you're going to change the value of your aperture to match that of the chart. And what do I mean by that? So if f16 is a sunny, cloudless day, f11 is a sunny day that's partly cloudy. But maybe it's a sunny day where suddenly there's all clouds, but it's still pretty bright. Well, that becomes f8, right? So we're decreasing the amount of light available to the film and the camera because we've gone from a bright, cloudless, sunny day to a bright day where there's all clouds. Now, what if it's a little bit less sunny and the clouds are still there? Well, then we're gonna open that aperture a little bit more down to f5.6. And what if then we're kind of working in the shade, or maybe it's sunset, then we move it down to f4. It's really as simple as that. Now, some of this is trial and error, and some of it is just practice. For example, when I started using Sunny 16, I would go out here in New York City and just try and figure out what most of the circumstances that I would be shooting in would be. Now, we do have a lot of sun here in New York City for a lot of the year, but as you know, the buildings here are massive. They're super tall, there's a lot of shade, and so even on the brightest, sunniest days, we're not often shooting at f16 here because there's still a lot of shade that's going to be crowding into a lot of different compositions. So for me, I actually found that most of my street photography here in New York City using Sunny 16 was somewhere between f8 and f5.6, sometimes even down to f4. So I know that that's kind of the range that I'm going to be working in. Maybe you live somewhere that's super bright and where you have big wide open skies. You're probably going to be working mostly in the f16 to f8 range. Or maybe you live somewhere up north where it's kind of cloudy all the time. You're going to be working more in the f8 to the f4 range. It's worth just going out and practicing on some rolls of film, or more economically, going out with a digital camera and testing those same exposures. Do the same thing. Set your ISO and your shutter speed so that they don't change using that digital camera, and then just go out and start playing with the aperture. You can even put your aperture on automatic and let your camera tell you what some of those readings would be, and go back and study those images. But the easiest way is to just go out and practice. That's the way that I did it, and that's the way that I learned. Now that's really it. That is the rule of Sunny 16. It's super easy, and if you follow these rules and really learn that chart, you're going to have great exposure outdoors when you're shooting, 95% of the time. Now I will say, it's better to try and overexpose when you're shooting film than to underexpose. It's really hard to get details back from the shadows. So if you have any doubt about what to do, err on the side of making the image a little bit brighter, or opening the aperture a little bit more. Maybe you're not sure if it's a situation that would be f8 or f5.6, go with 5.6, just in case. It's better to overexpose the image just a little bit than to underexpose it, because film is pretty forgiving with highlights, and that's probably the topic for a whole nother video. But just to say, go out and practice. It's a really, really easy thing to get good at. It sounds complicated, even in explaining a very simple video like this, but I promise you, if you set your ISO and your shutter speed to match, and you go out and start playing with the aperture and looking at that chart, you will have this down in an hour, and you will never look back. This is the easiest way to expose your images for film photography, hands down, and you can apply it in almost any circumstance. Okay, there is one caveat here. This is not a great technique if you're trying to shoot portraits, or if you're one of those people who loves to shoot everything super wide open. You've got, an f1.4 lens, or some kind of a Summilux, or you've got something where you're obsessed with always shooting super wide open, so it's like this super creamy, tons of bokeh in your images. This technique is probably not for you. This technique is for people who are out in the streets looking for moments, understanding that maybe zone focus is the thing for them, but aren't sure how to be fast and not have to be looking at their camera and fiddling with settings all the time. This is for those people. So that is the caveat. If you're a portrait photographer, you're shooting inside, you're shooting at night, this is not for you. This rule is meant to help you during the daytime when you're out and about in the world and just want to be able to react fast. So go practice, and I'd love to see some images. Send me a DM on Instagram, shoot me an email. I'd love to see what you're getting and hear how it's going for you. Now, as a way to wrap this video up, I'm going to show you a couple of examples of both film and digital images that I've made using this rule over the past handful of months, just so you can see how the exposure works on some of these images and the different lighting conditions across that full range of the chart, how they look like in a place like New York, or some of these images I think are also from Italy. So I hope you enjoy the images. Please let me know if you've got a favorite. Let me know if you found this video helpful. Give this a like. Please subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. I appreciate it so much. It really helps this video to get in front of more people and for the channel to grow. So sincerely, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.
So bad I miss bound this time for closure. You want what you want, that must be awful. But please pull up your pants.